listen to stuff on. I listen to podcasts and audiobooks, so I would miss out on. I would miss out on the. So yeah. It's a good podcast though. I just shame. Of Hazard, the King of Kings. They did a podcast on the alternate history of Rome, and yes, this made me tired. Yes. I have been listening to the Revolutions podcast, to the French Revolution podcast, and to be fair, I've basically found out that Keha of the Dissecting Worlds podcast. Well, I haven't found out. It's a thing to design religious paraphernalia for their podcast because they were doing a podcast on religion. It's quite a lot like Rome. Yes, that was our podcast on Judge Dredd. It's quite a lot like Rome. Yes, I do think it was quite a lot like Rome. The character on vid, as it were, on video podcast, as it were. Then we will do a first sort of introductory. Not the point. I don't listen to podcasts for their. I don't listen to podcasts on things I know about in order. Whatever. You thought a podcast was tense, you fucking lay about. Yeah, I was listening to that, and I have incidentally decided have any sound stuff to worry about, so you can just listen to podcasts or audiobooks while you play it. So yay! That to a certain extent I can just play while listening to a podcast now, because the big thing I have in Skyrim is that or dare I say it, the podcast that shall not be named, so I can find out what the fuck esoteric Jahanism is. I've been catching up on Review the Future podcast, and I caught up with the Review the Future podcast basically around the time that finally but both the Optional Podcast and Podquisition will be like, yeah, so I found a new fetish game. Distractions with things like Let's Plays and podcasts and interacting with people is a fundamentally draining. I could do more writing, or I could record a Let's Play, or I could listen to podcast episodes because there's a new Dissecting Worlds episode, or I've kind of been despairing, and I've been listening to the Revolutions podcast, and I did in fact do a blog sort of effectively saying, hey, I'm logical, and it's a one-parter, so it should be easy, and hey, podcasts are about an hour long. I was an idiot, I should have just checked the time, but a Blackley comic punchline at the end of the School of Movies podcast on Gamersgate, because, at some point, there is gonna be, Dan Carlin, in his podcast, talks about, what he calls stuff, because, again, I listen to podcasts, and people don't, but that's fine, this is the internet. And some podcasts to make note of, Podquisition, Wordfunk, Dissecting Worlds, Revolution. I was listening to this, podcast about Harry Potter, and I don't know why I went Yorkshire then. About maybe would be good if it was, if it was just like listening to podcasts, and it's something that's not hard, but is just in very sort of videos. I watch reviews, I watch Let's Plays, I listen to in-depth podcasts on history and that stands out as so much better compared to that wretched podcast, which opened with basically, there isn't that sense with the Revolution podcast. With the Revolution podcast, it's like, I tried to, Let's Plays, I'm recording Let's Plays, playing video games, listening to podcasts, and I'm constantly just like, Acquisition, Wordfunk, Dissecting Worlds, Revolutions podcast, the Dungeons and Dragons podcast. This is a good introduction to it. And then it gets into the storytelling, and you
genuinely a member of this demographic, and so their podcasts and videos and what have you are going to be appropriate. I generally as well also listen to podcasts or whatever because they have a set length, and there is like a pause. Movies are fucking amazing, and I still follow left-wing LGBTQA plus podcasts. I mean, I'm fucking bisexual myself, so yeah. When this was blowing up, I was like, okay, step away, listen to a podcast, watch some Let's Plays, chill the fuck out.
Other series, the Revolutions podcast. They've done the British Revolution. They have done the Revolution playing. You know, I'm used to listening to podcasts or audiobooks. I'm not used to going, yes, and here we are.
As the way this gameplay takes place, it will be mostly a podcast, right? I am poor. I don't have money for assets on Roll20.
It's just like, well, because they're friends, because they've been doing like 200 episodes of the podcast now. Like, they're, you know, it's, you know, the people was when it was first on, because I was just listening to the Psychomedia podcast. It wasn't entirely like, fuck Doctor, that I keep coming back to as the game I play while listening to podcasts is Minecraft. A game that I have at this point
play Minecraft or Skyrim whilst listening to podcasts or audiobooks, because it helps me remember all of those.
And so I've been ashamed to listen to the Verity podcast forevermore. I have
I've discovered the Digital Gonzo podcast, digital Gonzo production.
I don't think there's actually any more podcasts or whatever that I listen to. I mean, I suppose if you like Let's Plays,
park up and listen to my audiobooks and my podcasts and play some Skyrim. So yeah. I don't know, really. I don't. Asshole who bullied me in school had offered to have me on their podcast. I forced myself to give a listen to the podcast where they
about comics in the Major Spoilers podcast. And really, this is why I'm angry. I know I follow 2 different Doctor Who podcasts. I know 3 different Doctor Who podcasts.
And I was like, still want to listen to this crap podcast. But I was feeling tired. So I got these things.
One theory that I've seen voiced by Matt Farr of the Dissecting Worlds podcast, apparently that comes from actual. I think I'm going to make this into a podcast. Yeah. Oh my god, seriously, School of Movies is amazing. Best podcast, brilliant. I love it. It's like Dissecting Worlds and podcasts on the podcasts on Twilight and the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy. The 50 Shades of Grey trilogy, interesting.
And Cortex and Hello Internet, awesome podcasts of awesomeness. And I've already got a new podcast lined up after I finish this New Adventures podcast.
The Staggering Stories podcast is brilliant. And they do great reviews of like Firefly. Well, they would spend every fucking day in the gym whilst listening to podcasts and music, and that would be fine. Hell, I need to.
It's enough. And I'm going to go and I don't know, listen to a podcast, do some writing, yeah. What, sort of Dan Carlin, or listening to Dan Carlin's latest Common Sense podcast sort of made me think of podcasts. I'm a big fan of the Crux podcast. I'm a big fan of Dan Carlin's Common Sense podcast, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. Fucking revolution it is now. I'm presuming it's Spain that the Revolutions podcast is talking about now. And at this point, I'm not even listening. I'm just like in the.
And when I listened to podcasts, that was good. You know, I had some podcasts saved up. I had some podquisitions that I hadn't listened to. Listen to as many podcasts and audiobooks as it needs to get the game finished on your own. Go deep into. I need to go looking for podcasts. I need to find a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy podcast. I need Thrones, and sort of how I finished off the night was playing more Skyrim and listening to a podcast about Game of Thrones. I decided to check out a podcast. I just decided to check out a podcast.
Dan Carlin. I've listened to the History of Rome podcast. I listened to basically the entirety of the English. The attest too that they are basically like solo podcasts. In that I will just go on a topic until I hit pause, and people just play on their games and Nostalgia Critic and the Spooning Experiment, but like as a podcast and like as one thing, and it's just I love the person who I do the introductory mini-series of sort of podcast well they're going to be podcast videos of
so I'm going to try and take this seriously. So I track down a podcast, Major Spoilers Podcast, and it's, you know, comics and pop culture, and staggering stories isn't updating because everybody's ill. The Doctor Who Book Club podcast isn't updating. The Doctor Who Writers Room isn't if he or someone like him could just do like a podcast that was every week, and today we are going to discuss this aspect. I don't listen to any of his songs myself, but I am a good fan of the Dissecting Worlds podcast. And they have quoted his...
I don't actually listen to many political podcasts because I am trying to kind of. I have the iPad and it's got a nice problem saying, "Hey, there's a new NerdCube podcast." Yes, I will probably listen to that. Movies podcast on Gamersgate because to be honest, the School of Movies podcast on Gamersgate was very fair in that, which are both. If you are listening to me as a podcast, listen to them, they are better. But listening to the School of Movies podcast on Pacific Rim, and actually it's very, and I kind of like listening to audiobooks and podcasts on repeat now. I'm good. I'm pretty. I mean, bearing in mind, like I have been, doing research into like the Revolutions podcast. I've been doing research in of the Major Spoilers podcast as episodes of the Major Spoilers podcast with the sort of the audience surrogate, a rather loud ginger Scottish person who records on the Verity podcast, who was at Nine Worlds the year before. Basically an advert for a podcast that I'm not in any way affiliated with, but I just really love. I've stayed up late playing Skyrim, listening to podcasts, and I sort of found myself slipping back into the woking mentality. It's only communication under pressure. This is one of the reasons why a podcast is not a good idea for me to do. Particularly, and I searched on iTunes, and there was the Dissecting Worlds podcast talking about
talking about, the
on there were new iTunes podcast thingies, so so I ended up listening to Nerdcube podcasts on and podcasts are free. Podcasts are free, like free entertainment is fucking everywhere nowadays. Sounds a little bit like Matt Farr on the Dissecting Worlds podcast, except younger and cooler. And it's I love everyone on this. It's listening to that point in the French Revolution podcast with Mike Duncan, where like it's all just purges. I probably won't be doing any more Sith Life School of Movies podcasts today, I suppose, because Christmas Day. But I can, list that I can play while listening to podcasts, and so it's like, well, what else can I do that just involves looking at stuff and using my... I can genuinely be more interested in this than the podcast. It's quite good, because it's like, your brain can just pick, okay, a lot about society, I think. So go listen to this on a podcast, playing your favourite game. I sense a stupid email, and I have a massive sense of shame when it comes to, podcasters. Nowhere else I can happily say anything to you guys. Otherwise, do I just give up podcasts? Just give up podcasts and stories for theatre. But in his podcasts, there is so much of a sense that it feels above all of the people that I've mentioned, the kind of relevant, tangential way to the topic of the podcast. I am against halal and kosher. Silently, on Halloween, after I have listened to the correct podcast about all the weird, strange things that have happened and have this idea. I mean, I listened to the Psychomedia podcast. It's not what you think. It's the psychology, and I am playing Skyrim and I'm listening to podcasts. I can't check Facebook. I ain't checking Facebook. I'm not checking my emails. It's all well and good me, recommending, the History of Rome podcast, the Revolutions podcast. Do this quest. Well, I just need to finish this podcast. I just need to finish this story. A joke I could make about how much I love Dissecting Worlds, the podcast, because I literally masturbate to it. I mean, okay, I masturbate to it because applying for jobs, volunteering, whenever fucking parents get too much. I've got new podcasts, I've got new games to play, I've got Jahans, and I've just finished listening to Critical Hit, the Critical Hit podcast. I have finished catching up badly or poorly and how them as different things, and I love the School of Movies podcast, which visits quite extensive back catalogue. I love my computer's crap, but this is why I like Let's Plays and podcasts and, well, videos much like the one you're watching. Playing video games while listening to podcasts. And that started out as me wanting to play video games. And something else they do. Adverts. Pledge drives. In the podcast itself. Walking up and down because I'm listening to an audiobook or a podcast or just some really good music. And it's my exercise. I sort of listen to their podcasts on the Fast and the Furious films yesterday whilst playing Civ 5, and then this podcast empire. This podcast empire. Because, you know, it might only be one string, and so kind of listening to this gaming podcast, especially when I've got these two competing things, the World War Z podcast in and of itself ain't that great. But that doesn't matter, because kind of
essentially I've been listening to the Dan Carlin Hardcore History podcast, and
but the podcast makes it sound very interesting, and the podcast is the life that I fucking live for. Girls writing Skyrim and podcasts. No chance in hell. You can listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, Dan Carlin's Common Sense podcast. You can listen to Sam Harris's Waking. This was the time when I was into podcasts because I was unemployed. I was unemployed and I love video games, and I sort of that I needed podcasts and video games going at the same time, that I needed the sense of empowerment. And oh yeah, having listened to the James Bond podcast by School of Movies, I want to watch James Bond now. But then you know, I'm listening to the Hello Internet podcast as, you know, bloody Brady Harron and CGP Grey are talking about, you know,
and it got to the end of the co-optional podcast, and I was just like, okay.
To the Cracked podcast and the Kurt Vonnegut's podcast and Kurt Vonnegut. Interesting.
The creator of the History of Rome podcast, Mike Duncan, called the Revolutions podcast, covering the British Civil War, or English Civil War.
I've been writing a lot of fiction and listening to a lot of podcasts about James Bond. And yes, lovely ladies, I am going to hell. The Hello Internet binge, and now I'm kind of catching up on the podcasts that I've done, and I'm kind of thinking, what next? Before the podcast in earnest actually fucking starts. This will be a podcast, video thing in the sense.
Amount of joy in listening to the History of Rome podcast and just running around Rome, killing people, going like, yay!
And maybe part of the reason that I'm gonna gush about this podcast so much is that I'm listening to Dan Carlin. I was listening through some of Dan Carlin's old Common Sense podcasts, because I have figured out I have gotten a podcast manager on my tablet. So I've been listening to Hello Internet on my tablet while walking around the park. All gonna be cool. And then basically I listened to the School of Movies podcast on the recent Stephen King It film, and I basically
spoils and that I was on Twitter and stuff and listening to the podcast, and I didn't realise I'd run over, and so I just saw this post from
I had learned about Gallifrey 1 through listening to a podcast known as Radio Free Skaro. Don't really listen to
this guy of Dissecting Worlds, this podcast I listen to. He's always like, Star Trek NCIS would be awesome. Listening to the History of Rome podcast and whatever. So I had completely forgotten everything about Rome, so I
can re-listen to a podcast or an audiobook because that's only one input, so I can be doing something.
We're closed. Were there any good podcasts that I have listened to? Infinite Monkey Cage. That,
and I would highly recommend checking out the Critical Hit podcast by the people at Major Spoilers. Start from episode 1. That's what I did.
And I completely play it whilst I'm listening to podcasts. That's what I like in a game. I love the intelligent story. And, you know, there are podcasts that I listen to, that I subscribe to through iTunes. And how combat works will be shown off in the podcast before the podcast in earnest actually fucking starts. It is screamy and dark and beyond the end. And you've got a podcast talking about that. It is all screaming, and this podcast is basically, it's like the podcast digests Pacific Rim for you, so that you can get past the kind of... I don't know, maybe would you guys appreciate a kind of like report on Let's Plays I love, or on podcasts that I love and listen to, or even listening to a podcast, listening to an audiobook. And if I can walk up that hill that way, I have a phone with music on or with podcasts on, you know. I need to load the podcast onto that because that was the problem I had at 9 months. I mean, it's even if it's for a podcast, I don't mind, you know, playing, sort of being guest magic-y guy. The internet was dodgy as well, so that was fucking fun. And then I wake up to find a fucking podcast that shall not be named. But we can listen to music, we can listen to audiobooks, we can listen to podcasts. You know, and podcasts are free. Podcasts are free. I have a listen to some of the podcast that shall not be named segments on me, and maybe I might actually go on it quite a while. And it's funnily enough, it was the Dissection Worlds podcast on horror, or that they just a lot of Let's Plays. I watch a lot of reviews. I listen to a lot of podcasts, things that are free, or at least they're ad supported, right? You know, there may come a day when they in podcasting, which was useful for like, because I am thinking of doing podcasts and stuff in the future, and that was just kind of right. Christopher Odd and his Let's Plays of the BioShock series. Because one of the few podcasts that I have not listened to by School of Charge on the battery, and that's good. That's what you wanted to do. So essentially, I needed a podcast to listen to, and then being, you know, clearly what he thinks, his podcast showed enough people why they genuinely happened to think. To all I'd sort of heard of it was the left-wing people saying, Gamersgate, they're all evil. And then I listened to the podcast, and yeah, the fight books and play my Minecraft and listen to podcasts, because you know what, dear sweet YouTubekins, 2 and a bit series of the West Wing left to work through. Still a whole load of awesome podcasts. I think I've got now 3. I am playing whilst listening to podcasts or audiobooks, so therefore I don't hear the in-game engine, and so I want to just play that as a game. I don't want the distraction of audiobooks or podcasts. But I have this problem now, whereby I mean, I listened to Review the Future podcast, which is an amazing podcast, by the way, and people say, I get the feeling. I think Joshua Carity is on that podcast as well, ripping into it as well. I may be wrong, but either way, it's this to do with my hands whilst I am listening to podcasts and audiobooks. And yes, incidentally, since when I mention that, some of you will have thought this, it's because there's a new Dissecting Worlds episode where I could finally listen to that podcast that shall not be named episode and segment on Esoteric Jahans, in a lot of ways, because the review of Pacific Rim is the last podcast by
I've caught up on podcasts that I care about. I have just basically got the Shark still working in the Peacekeeper Wars.
40 AM, and I've just finished listening to a 2-hour podcast in which Total Biscuit, the true wielder.
Why that sort of podcast would appeal to me at the moment. Help.
So certainly, if you are looking for a podcast game, check out City Skylines, because it's a game where you don't need, albeit I'm watching a Let's Play, or I'm listening to a podcast, or I'm playing Minecraft, or I'm doing something.
By the Kurt Vonnegut podcast today is that I've been thinking about for a while is this idea that kind of but you know what? When I listen to a Cortex podcast and I listen to CGP Grey say
days binging Skyrim while listening to School of Movies podcasts on the Batman films, on the Spider-Man films, on the You're Just Being a Dick crops up, like they mentioned it in the Optional podcast, you know, the occasion. I recommend that you listen to the School of Movies podcast on Pacific Rim. It's actually the last interesting analysis of the situation. I do recommend Dan Carlin's Common Sense podcast, and the latest episode, the one on Europe, and the Spoonie Experiment meets Dissecting Worlds in a podcast. And there's a woman on it, which I love it. I love dark, gritty, all screaming from the future. Oh, and so the podcast is all this is so horrible, you know, sort of quoting Mark. It's kind of fun, but kind of creepy, especially when you know nothing about the podcast and you're just like, hello, we're Doctor Who video series. And the Nerd Cube podcast, by the way, has Many a True Nerd on it, which basically, like, my brain and the need to listen to podcasts. So it doesn't really matter whether the grindy action is. And so I googled World War Z podcasts, and I have to say, honestly, the World War Z podcast in and of itself, I basically had to be badgered into leaving a review for this podcast that I really like, School of Movies. One of these things, like, and I found, like, this podcast, the Dungeon Masters Block podcast, and it was on also Star Trek and Ghostbusters. But when you're talking about YouTubers and podcasters, when you're talking about new media. But I've listened to the Revolutions podcast, and I'm interested in revolutions. And I'm interested in how they happen. You might have gathered from the poor History of Rome podcast review that I did, is that I like the intrigue, I like the backstabbing, depth and detail, and they mentioned the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan. They in fact wanted to get him on the podcast. Kind of has it as a running joke that Rome is brought up a lot. Well, the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan. I listened an attempt to explain, right? You know, I've been listening to podcasts about, you know, the First World War and stuff, and, you know, indeed, you know, one thing that Dan Carlin discussed on his Common Sense podcast is this idea that basically caught up with all the School of Movies podcasts now. Finished watching all the Star Wars. But anyway, I highly recommend you listen to the History of Rome podcast, because there are 2 follow-up series. There is the series
they're going to want to sort of listen to the podcast where it is demonstrated how the game actually works, how an encounter is, by fucking leaving me well alone and making sure your podcast is less of a racist pile of shit. I've been listening to the School of Movies podcast, and the School of Movies is amazing. Alex Shaw, you recommending, the History of Rome podcast, the Revolutions podcast.
Because apart from anything else, I've listened to the Revolutions podcast, which have tackled the American Revolution, the English Revolution, and
sub-series of the Revolutions podcast by Mike Duncan. So there is a new sort of set of...
and listening to podcasts or audiobooks. It's Skyrim. I have listened to too many podcasts about superhero films, and I have watched too many episodes of... I also know that that's not actually him in the podcasts. That is what... That was the run that kind of got me into Doctor Who. So listening to this podcast and kind of getting some closure on the Virginia Adventure. And Dan Carlin, in his Common Sense podcast, he's talked before about, well, maybe you could use this system. Maybe I've now since listened to podcasts and been like, oh, those are really cool places.
And some of it's small things. It's, it's podcasts and let's plays, and the fact that women are
100 episodes in, sort of like four different podcasts into it, and they're like, yes, I mean, obviously.
But there will probably at some point be an official podcast feed. Although of course you are more than you do, because people forget. They forget. I listen to so many podcasts, and I only him in the podcasts. That is what he becomes when he is doing the podcast. And indeed, you can see that change to believe Gamersgate was about ethics in games journalism, and so his podcast was fair enough to convince me that there... I think you can kind of see where this is going now. Left Wing Podcast reviewing something called Independence Day, and to the podcast that shall not be named segment on esoteric Jahanism. Now, I listened,
and here's where I go back to the podcast comparison, is that you compare the Revolution podcast
to choose from. You have all of the podcasts, all of the Let's Plays, all of the vlogs, all of the edits and... I want to, yes. So I was between podcasts and feeling a bit down. Watching Tom's...
but kind of enjoyable to do while I listen to podcasts and audiobooks, and Minecraft is the thing. Let's play the Minecraft videos, and then I'm going to listen to podcasts and play some Skyrim, because crikey O'Reilly, that was a... That's...
Watching films, playing video games and listening to podcasts, I am gonna fucking love it. And you know why I know I'm gonna fucking love it? Because it helps to remind people. I mean, apparently it helps, podcasters to, apparently it helps podcasters to leave
I've sent a slightly stupid email to him once because of his other podcast, which I am about to recommend, the Doctor Who Book Club.
Hormone deficiency. I talked about it before a bit in the last podcast, but I've only recently really done the hell away from fanfiction right now. But I've just listened to
this amazing podcast called School of Movies, which that's why I need YouTube channels. That's why I need to be listening to podcasts and playing video games and you would be interested in doing some kind of podcast or whatever, then yeah, fuck it. Talk through any of and podcasts, the podcasts I listen to are very much self-deprecating. It's like, David Wong, Jason Pardian was saying on the Cracked podcast about how his one, it should very swiftly become the entire history of podcasts, but yeah. Anyway, I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to let you know. I'm not really paying attention to the podcasts. So yeah, I'm missing out on stuff. I've done a video before on the themes and symbolism of that podcast, but I just kind of wanted to explain what the fuck it. I've been organising my emails, and partly it's because I've been listening to the Cortex podcast with CGP Grey. What's going to happen now is that I am going to spend some time catching up on podcasts, catching up on films, catching up on YouTube videos, and also Civ 5 is awesome, and podcasts are awesome, and the YouTube people that I subscribe to are awesome. I listen to any of his songs myself, but I am a good fan of the Dissecting Worlds podcast, and they have quoted his. You can do sound effects, you can do musical cues. I know people who who are in podcasts all the time and do this thing kind of generally.
Mate! I fuck it, everything is gone. All I have left are podcasts and simple solitaire. I'll be okay.
I suppose the podcast that shall not be named has gone from being complete shit to being so this economist podcast. Hold on.
So yeah, it's this economics podcast, a bit series of the West Wing. We'll have to work through. Still a whole load of awesome podcasts. I think I've got now 3 of.
I think I might have to make this episode a podcast episode. I think it's probably a bit long. Okay, filled with DVDs and books and podcasts and music and videos and let's plays, and that was actually spoiled for me by TV Tropes, because I was going through this podcast and I was like, I've got to check out TV Tropes. So I remember faces. Names I'm not so good on, so podcasts are kind of weird. But basically, there is this sort of I listen to so many podcasts, and I only left a review on someone's podcast when the guy literally sort of politics with their favourite YouTube personality, their favourite podcast personality. It's that they want me to personally discuss me for this to end. And in fact, I'm going to share this on the Pratchett podcast Facebook group, because that's on Black, because that was the problem I had at 9 World Geek Fest, where I was kind of like, oh, I have no podcasts on here. This is awkward. Can I just show you the School of Movies podcast on this? Can I just make you listen to this and just learn why it's not okay? A bit stressful when you're listening to podcasts or whatever, just like, is something going to go about, is this going to be a cool moment? It's very, very meaningful, the podcast.
in a lot of ways, because this. But also, I decided, fuck it, I shall listen to a School of Movies podcast episode, because I also have to catch up on that, and I'm like,
the point where I basically I caught up with all of these podcasts that I had saved up to listen to. Joy! Anyway, I've been listening to Cracked.com, Cracked's podcast, and
damn depressing. I mean, if I was, listening to podcasts or watching my YouTube, my standard, YouTube subscription thing, statement to make. Oh, right, that's right. Yeah, the fucking podcast that shall not be named are fascists.
or just a tour of the city. But in the Revolutions podcast, this is segmented out. And
I mean, I've been listening to the School of Movies podcast at the moment, listening through their back catalogue, registration volunteering work, and I've got nice challenging stuff to do. I've got new podcasts to listen to. I've sort of realised I just decided to check out a podcast, and I ended up deciding, oh, Dan Carlin's hardcore hit. The good thing about Let's Plays and, podcasts and video games is that, Let's Plays, I know they're full of shit. The School of Movie, the last Digital Gonzos podcast on Pacific Rim is actually, and I scrambled for podcasts, like, one of these things, like, and I can allow me to listen to music, so I can already put podcasts and audiobooks onto it. So, yeah, it's 4 hours long, but I want to talk about that podcast and about other things. It's just brilliant and glorious and tremendously in depth, like 3-hour-long podcasts, and they're all tremendously funny and other people. And when I listened to podcasts, that was good. I had talking about me on their show. I didn't care. Stupid podcast are fucking racists. Who gives a shit?
Well, I rediscovered these hints about the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan, and I'd caught up with Dissecting Worlds, hence I was listening to text lately. Probably related, actually, given that finishing a podcast or Let's Play series often leaves me feeling at a loss. The point, though, I can always watch my Let's Plays later. I can always listen to my podcast and play Skyrim later. Writing, so long as I'm not actually in the fucking no, just because I fucking like it. I don't actually need a fresh podcast to listen to, and like I've been a review of the Revolutions podcast by Mark Duncan. The first revolution, yes. So I listened to this podcast before I saw Pacific Rim, and it's what actually made me buy Pacific Rim. And that, by the way, that podcast is why I don't debate. Because it's just this guy saying, no, but I huge, who runs Geek Syndicate and thus the great podcast behemoth that Dissecting Worlds is run on, and I was in this. I am going to listen to a podcast. What I will do is I will say I'm a build a big gigantic thing. Those people were awesome. I said hello to the Doctor Who podcast, and one of them, Heather, I think it was, because the female master came along, and everybody I know in the Doctor Who podcast and in the Doctor Who fandom in general was like, no! On the plus side, I am listening to the British History podcast, and it is fucking amazing. And I one session, starting from a new world, one session, whilst I listen to a podcast, and it's boring. It is absolutely boring. Yes, I shall have the best gaming and podcast experience ever. I don't know why I'm turning into a mad scientist. I'm starting to get into D&D now because, Major Spoilers does the Critical Hit podcast, and I've read, The Order of the Stick. I don't like script so much. I vastly prefer the podcast. But it certainly helps knowing, having seen
At least there is walking and listening to podcasts and eating a well-prepared meal. At least
we're gonna build a thing, and it's gonna be amazing. And and the podcasts, which are like, even when it's like Roman, and Stephen says, and new listeners can go fuck themselves. I've got a podcast. You fucker!
I caught up on Wordfunk, and I caught up on there were new iTunes podcast thingies. So
with my fucking Let's Plays and my podcasts and my computer games. I mean, I've just bought Morrowind and Oblivion. It's the Psychology Comedy Media Podcast. PSYCO Media. Psycho Media Podcast. It's Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast. Where shall I begin? Basically, you have to get it as part of the Geek Syndicate podcast because it's in that podcast series. But anyway, the point is, talked about in this Dissecting Worlds podcast, this idea, they talked about, serial killers and, slashers and are the kind of games where listening to a podcast or an audiobook at the same time doesn't really work. Part of the psyche, part of how I listen to podcasts and audiobooks, and so is therefore kind of important.
It's worth it because there are good Let's Plays, because there are good podcasts, because I love my writing, because there are beautiful people. Came Digital Drift and now School of Movies. So there are like 4 different podcasts that kind of are all part. I'm not going to be listening to my audiobook, I'm not going to be listening to my podcast, so therefore that defeats the entire fucking point of it. And I want to live because living is amazing. I have multiple podcasts that I love, a few good friends that I keep in regular contact with, and I know, I'm reviewing a podcast. Who reviews podcasts? I mean, why review a podcast? You don't have to pay for it. Check him out. He's awesome. And check out the books. Check out the Doctor Who Book Club podcast, because they've covered quite a few. And I'm sort of running out of podcasts too that I like. So there was kind of like that in the History of Rome podcast, in that in the 180 I've done writing, and I have played Skyrim and listened to podcasts, and I have just been up the road and got food, and about this time, little podcast called The Daily Fucking Holocaust decided. Yes, it was my birthday yesterday. I have been listening to the Review of the Future podcast. First mini-series of the Dungeons and Dragons sort of podcast vids have gone out. Revolutions podcast, the French Revolution podcast. And I've been,
like the revolution, the Great Terror, so tense, then I would be able to focus more on the podcast. But to be honest, that is good because there have been.
Well, I have a goodish computer. I have a load of interesting podcasts and games to play if I like. Happens with revolutions and holocausts, but basically, listen to those podcasts, though they are amazing.
Quite a while, and it's funnily enough, it was the Dissection Worlds podcast on horror, or that they just about how they have Nazi podcasts that they should do, and the Jews are so horrible, and
I would probably say yes because I love their podcasts, right?
Time, listen to all these great podcasts and audiobooks, and at the same time, hopefully increase.
I'm broke as shit. I have Let's Plays and I have podcasts and audiobooks, right? Like, I would love to watch more Marvel and DC.
Better than listening to the sodding Doctor Who podcast whilst I play Minecraft. The answer is no. The answer is I listened to the Correctional podcast and I listened to the Podquisition
the other day because, like, I was listening to the Farscape Friday podcast, which is a brilliant podcast, and they happened.
Like Rome. Yes, very much like Rome. Yes, thank you. That was our podcast on Mass Effect. That's quite a lot like Rome. Yes, I do think it's quite a lot like. Just difficulty finding a good podcast app, because it's like, well, you found a good podcast app, but if you want to the French Revolution portion of the Revolutions podcast has been going on for an awful long time, and I've been listening to it every time with my Skyrim, with my podcasts and my audiobooks and my YouTube channel, and that's okay, and I'm cool with that. I listened to this podcast. Actually, I think I'll just do it for my notes. You know, I happened to stumble upon the School of Movies podcast because I had just who tries to learn about different things through the podcasts that I listen to, through the things that I watch, and I'm very Video Free Score or Dissecting Worlds. You are the podcast that I listen to, and you are fantastic and wonderful. Games developer famous for the Slaughtering Grounds, finally did a podcast interview with Jim fucking Sterlingson, and we listened to one of the sort of School of Movies podcasts that I really love. Something to do with my hands and something cool to watch whilst I am listening to audiobooks and podcasts, you know? When Laura can do that without bothering the part of you that's listening to the podcasts and the audiobooks and the good stuff. Staggering Stories are amazing. The Staggering Stories podcast are amazing. There'll be a link in the doobly-doo. I mean, like places like the Cracked podcast and Black Mirror and stuff. You can give is my subjective perspective on the School of Movies podcasts. I can't go through podcast by. I was just listening to the History of Rome podcast and playing Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Original comics, because I've listened to podcasts about the X-Men and stuff, and they've basically like read off the plot and stuff. And
there's still Minecraft, there's still Skyrim, there's still podcasts and Let's Plays and and pretty girls and
period where there weren't really many podcasts out updating, and it's like Radio Friscaro's not updating.
just this podcast series. It feels an injustice to call this a series.
This mentioned me, sort of did a shout out to me on the podcast about Gallifrey 1, and I was just like,
last time it was just horrible. It was the last podcast that they, well, pretty much basically every time they've mentioned me on this is to be forgotten. It's to be forgotten. I'm not gonna go on podcasts with the alt-right. Not out of
myself to do whatever the hell I like. So I would listen to podcasts and I would listen to audiobooks and I would just chip away at.
And so when I heard that an incredibly right-wing podcast hosted by people who remind me, having listened to the School of Movies podcast and fucking love them, I actually got a little bit of my counter that to keep going onwards. I mean, it was an interesting podcast that, kind of did entirely unravel my brain and sort of to the Farscape Friday podcast, which is a brilliant podcast, and they happen to talk about this episode, Mental as Anything,
is listening to the Psycho Media podcast and just pottering about, just being like, ooh, do. I'm going to build a castle. It's going to be, recording my own stupid Let's Play series. I'm listening to podcasts and stuff, but I think time I've been playing Cookie Clicker and Skyrim and listening to podcasts, and I was almost wondering, things have been grim,
it's partly because, well, it's a lot to do with the CGP Grey Cortex podcasts, and also a lot to do with other ways to listen to videos as podcasts. So that there will be an official podcast of it at some point.
Syndicate podcast because it's in that podcast series, but I know the point is the point is that dissecting worlds is awesome. So this is me saying I've just listened to a 2-hour-long podcast and I feel like making a video. And Chugga Conroy, oh yeah, Let's Play is so awesome, and hey, British History Podcast is so amazing because I'm
My Little Pony podcast, and the Gamersgate podcast, and the Fan Response podcast. I'm not looking forward to those.
Get an exercise bike in here so I can listen to my audiobooks and my podcasts on the bike. The second thing that's going to happen is that around about doing such weird videos now because they were solo vlogs to camera, solo podcasts to camera, and so we're gonna have these people on with their podcast and your podcast, and don't get me wrong, I like that. But basically, all white Englishmen, right? What are the podcasts? Basically, all white English, Canadian, or American men. One of the really beautiful things about the podcast, and essentially, I suppose, I look at listening to this this podcast on a subject that I thought I would like, in the sense that it was. Stephen must explain to newcomers, and he just says, "Fuck it, I've got a podcast." That's what Marvel is doing.
Bitch slapped me in the middle of their fucking podcast and said, "We want you to come on the show." And then but either way,
it's a very, very good podcast. And they're just awesome people as well.
Amazing Let's Players and podcasters and video games out there.
Thinking about doing a podcast for quite some time. Partly because, the thing about having a podcast is that it's basically with that. And the Cracked podcast had sort of started to awaken me to the fact that, okay, there are cults out there. And to the Revolutions podcast on the French Revolution at the moment, and it's kind of like, don't. Most of the time I'm fucking, I'm listening to podcasts, I'm playing Minecraft, I'm doing work, I'm writing. Listening to podcasts and researching tools and stuff to help me.
I sort of the Critical Hit podcast, and I would highly recommend checking out the Critical Hit podcast by the
Discworld audiobooks, and I wanted to hear some podcast talking about the watch books and Ankh-Morpork and repeat interpretation from a podcast which isn't about very much at all. Then today we are looking at Critical Hit. It's a podcast. A podcast by the crew of Major Spoilers. Seems like this guy Alex Shaw has basically, he had the Digital Cowboys podcast, then the Digital... But anyway, I've been thinking about doing a podcast for a while, and I think that is why Let's Plays and podcasts are valuable sources of information, and that's why they're so funny. Failing indeed. Even failing at listening to podcasts. Because I'm so intended to get that stuff confirmed, and there was people there from the Tea and Jeopardy podcast and stuff, so that was fun. Unfortunately, no one in space there. Delete some of these co-optional podcasts. Sorry, I'm not good at multitasking.
And listening to a really great podcast. Yeah. Incidentally, apparently some trolls are some Nazi trolls that don't even...
The Critical Hit podcast. Let's give it a roasting. Okay, so the plot. I suppose, projects for future. I do want to arrange a podcast. I do want to arrange a webcast. I am going to sort of badge on my jacket from the Dissecting Worlds podcast because they are just so very, very, very awesome. And I'm like getting distracted from podcasts and stuff to I'm just failing. I'm just failing, and I think I'll still listen to the podcasts, and if there's a good episode, I might check it. Is just listening to the History of Rome podcast, as recommended to me by Dissecting Worlds, and watching other episodes of the School of Movies podcasts, and he's got a cracking voice. And I've been listening to the British History podcast, learning about all the horrors that Brits have done between channels. The moment TV becomes like YouTube, like Blip, like podcasts, like audiobooks, the moment TV becomes well, I'm going to continue listening to a Cracked podcast about the presidential elections, actually. Yeah, they're kind of a very cool and quite creepy podcast in that they kind of have a severed head of poetry. They have a style.
But I do listen to the School of Movies podcast, and one of the things they talk about there is this idea of millennial. But I have podcasts. I have things to write, and for the moment, I have food. You know, watch all these shows and let's plays and podcasts, and I can do my writing, and I have infinite the School of Movies podcast review of it. So I knew that I could go into without knowing much backstory. I've just been re-listening to one of the old podcasts, to one of the old cracked podcasts about basically the later. I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna end up listening to that podcast episode, and it's a logical flow through that the great fuckwit used in the podcast that shall not be named, where he and that I can just listen to podcasts and audiobooks with. But got in some videos. I had some good food. I listened to some good podcasts, and then I went and I got my first. And so because the first one is all about certainty, the podcast is all about certainty. It's all about for half orcs after listening to the Critical Hit podcast with Pork. A duck. Yeah. In fact, I'm actually looking for a podcast at the moment that's kind of nice and light. The British History podcast, also, that's very remembered all these awesome episodes of the Critical Hit podcast, and I remembered, oh yeah, and I'm gonna listen to some podcasts, and since I can't play Minecraft, I'm probably going to play Solitaire. Interpretation every time I listen to the podcasts. And podcasts are just two people talking randomly. I have been listening to a lot of history podcasts, and he said this guy who genuinely believes that communism was. People didn't understand before finally a right-wing, far-right channel, far-right podcast basically called to come to this revelation by a podcast about Stephen King's hit. It's do it without the thing, without the podcast or the audiobook. So I'm now going into this thing blind. I'm now going into this of maybe going on the Daily Shower podcast. Maybe it might be a way to preach more left-wingism to the. But here's the thing. I am listening to this podcast at the moment called Cortex with CGP Grey and Mike Hurley. Someone like those fuckwits on the podcast that shall not be named because it is basically Jewish Holocaust. Listening to audiobooks or podcasts, playing Skyrim, watching YouTube videos or Blip videos. I'm taking a cue from Daniel O'Brien on Cracked.com's latest podcast here, but I do almost wonder if America does need a Pacific Rim. It's actually the last episode of the Digital Gonzo podcast, and is the reason why forth on the street. I mean, I've been listening to to the Correct podcast. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise. If anything, taking the persona from a set of podcasts or YouTube videos and turning that persona into a character to write stories.
And the History of Rome and the Revolutions podcast have tunes that are kind of classical. Certainly by contrast.
Doing. I'm loving the School of Movies podcast. I'm loving the Dissecting Worlds podcast.
I've listened to a lot of history podcasts recently, and I've been paying it.
Because I was between. I'm sort of between podcasts and between let's plays at the moment, and so the podcast makes it seem like, oh my god, this is the most insanely well thought out thing in the world. Is, hey, have you heard of this podcast called the Daily Jewish Holocaust? Yeah, they mentioned you. I think you should go on it. Worth of effort I'm not going to go through, right? It's just, I could leave a positive review for this podcast that I really love. Alright, show. But also, I'm not going to go on the podcast that shall not be named. Because fundamentally, I don't. It's going to be, okay, what's YouTube doing? Okay, what are the podcasts doing? And then once that's caught up, then I'll, be watching the films.
Actually, listen to podcasts while I'm doing. And History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan. I highly, highly recommend that you watch, because, it's brilliant.
I do not appreciate people on that podcast mocking the idea that they think
Past. From that moment on, the History of Rome podcast becomes tremendous. It becomes fascinating in a world of political. I only play games when I listen to podcasts and audiobooks, and I only listen to audiobooks because I can play games. I suppose I should shout out to the Verity podcast, even if I can't listen to it because I just shame. Verity, or like Paul Cornell from his podcasts, but it was still awesome. And that was when I sort of, and hey, look, all my audiobooks, all my podcasts, all my YouTube is here, so I can just have a cycle whilst doing a thing.
I still think that podcasts like the School of Movies are fucking amazing, and I still follow left wing. I want to read my ebooks whilst I'm on the train, or I want to listen to podcasts while I'm doing some jogging. Because I'm busy enough with the goddamn internet and with the YouTubes and the podcasts, and I've got that box of people playing D&D. It begins as an episode of the Major Spoilers podcast, as episodes of the Major Spoilers podcast. I pulled myself short, and I sold you guys a poor review of the History of Rome podcast because my urge to be naturalist. That Let's Play to watch, having that podcast or audiobook to listen to, having that game to play, episode 100 or whatever of the Digital Drift podcast or whatever. Because, oh, by the way, they basically
they said at the end of the podcast, kind of like, in general, try to consider the other people's views and stuff, and it's like,
I'd finished listening to Sam Harris's podcast, and it was like early morning, it wasn't even early morning, it was fucking 8 o'clock. It was watch Let's Plays, listen to podcasts, listen to audiobooks, and play some goddamn Skyrim, and then after that, do sort of like to play games with the trolls. And that's why I say that the podcasts that shall not be named are worthy. While I listen to audiobooks and while I listen to podcasts, alright? I love video game culture, but I'm not a good gamer. whether I would do this as kind of a straight up response to the podcast, or whether I would kind of go into
it's on my mind. I'm listening to the Revolutions podcast. I'm listening to history podcasts that are pretty much. Well, no, I'm here. I'm literally like here in my room listening to the Revolutions podcast. As Mike Duncan is going. I'm listening to the Dan Carlin Common Sense podcast now. And Dan Carlin's, I met
in games and listening to audiobooks and podcasts and trying to keep myself going for one more day and one more day.
You might like me to say kind of like my what I have learned so far podcast or videos, kind of just a video saying.
Oh, okay, well, I like listening to history podcasts, yes. Listen to all of the history about why you're going. Felt inclined to be. Instead, I've been, listening to podcasts, watching Let's Plays, and talking to my boyfriend. And okay, I'm listening to this podcast. Oh, blimey, it's really pissing it down at the moment.
And the last optional podcast that I just finished listening to.
Long dead philosophers! Hey, have you watched this right-wing person? Hey, subscribe to this podcast! And it's like, no, I've got
hearing Paul Cornell talk to people on podcasts and reading blog posts and possibly even like
things are okay. I've got audiobooks to listen to. I've got podcasts to listen to. I've got movies to watch and podcast. Well, they're going to be podcast videos of the Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition campaign.
Like I've been listening to the Cracked podcast, with the totally not gonna be contentious at all title of. He writes on crack.com and he regularly contributes to the crack.com podcast. And I'm genuinely a massive fan of the stuff he writes, and he did podcasts about the Discord, because I listened to podcasts about Doctor Who and I was just like, oh, I want to find pod. It's so immersive, you can't get out. Like even listening to podcasts at the same time, which is kind of like going down.
And it was Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast that I listened to.
Rodrigo's nice and interesting, and I hadn't listened to any of the Made Spots podcast at this point. When I first listened to this, Spec Ops: The Line is one I don't actually like. It isn't fun. I can't listen to a podcast and play this because it won't shut the heck up. I'm playing Skyrim again. I'm playing a game again while I listen to podcasts and audiobooks. So it's like, yeah, boom. I think I might watch Farscape: The Peacekeeper Wars, or listen to some podcasts and play some Skyrim. I'm not really sure. Anyway, I want to find podcasts about the Discworld, and now I actually know someone who runs a podcast about the Discworld. But anyway, I 3-hour audiobook podcast that was in 2 parts. So for me, like, Dan Banks's books, and then probably start on another podcast about something else. My problem is that, I have podcasts to listen to and audiobooks to listen to, and, I can't find a game that.
So few shows and podcasts and whatever with women in them. I'm listening to this new politics podcast at the moment called Econ Talk, and it's with a lot of right-wing people. A lot of people. I listened to Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast. I've listened to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. and I just made a 3-hour-long podcast exploring why there are some nuanced perspectives to various different things.
I have all of these audiobooks and podcasts that I want to listen to, and that, you know, they're how I get a good deal of information and how I
review whatever podcast on Mass Effect 3. And I'm sort of I'm basically transferring things and tied and listening to 3 hours of the co-optional podcast. 3 fucking hours of the co-optional.
The 50th anniversary this year, okay? And I met the Staggering Stories podcast. It was like flipping Hogwarts.
Sort of just looking at this while I was listening to a podcast, and it's just like, fucking wow. This is the fucking world we live in.
I said I was gonna do all these things. I'm listening to a different podcast. Instead, I'm listening to CGP Kit Gray's. Talked about in this Dissecting Worlds podcast, this idea, you know, they talked about, you know, serial killers and, you know, slashers and
Time and no self-confidence. So, yay! Now I will go listen to co-optional podcast because Total Biscuit is awesome. Hello, I am Alex Jahans, and today marks the first podcast and video of nonsense. If you do watch the video,
a first series of the Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition video podcast I am calling. For the purposes of maybe doing a let's play later, at the same time as listening to podcasts and listening to audiobooks, at the same time as doing my writing, at the same time.
Who was Rome by the creator of the History of Rome podcast, Mike Duncan, called the Revolutions podcast.
Not really into musicals, so it was just kind of like I listened to a podcast that was a review of this, and I was like, yeah, this is horrible.
On my normal play when I listen to a podcast or whatever. So what do you guys think?
Far, when he's doing the Dissecting Worlds podcast, is very obviously taking on a certain role because there is a.
And at that point, I was just like, yay, podcast, it's awesome. But as I've been listening back to the Dissecting Worlds podcast,
I had called out to me, you know, called out, you know, in different podcasts, sort of people being critical of it, but I like.
Now, I'm gonna watch some YouTube videos and listen to podcasts, because yeah, I need to chill the fuck out after that. Oh, what acted? And listening to the podquisition is maybe not the best thing to do. The best.
So yeah, I'm gonna go for a walk and listen to a podcast. And this may be the one time in the history of
about video games when I want to read about video games and listen to podcasts about video games. I can do that. You know, when I want to engage. See, I've been listening to. I've been catching up on Review the Future podcast, and I caught up with the Review the Future podcast. Basically, is that like it's a really good podcast, and it's very left wing, and it's or specifically the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan. Okay, so I know I'm reviewing a podcast. Who reviews?
So, yesterday I was listening to the Cortex podcast, and they were talking about I mean, I've been, you know, listening to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History and Common Sense podcast, and
how to start a game of Dungeons and Dragons. And that was, you know, it's a great podcast, but in that situation, it was
tied up a lot of loose ends, and because I've spent this time playing Skyrim, listening to these podcasts, I've got quite the backlog.
I've got a podcast about, no, not podcast. I've got the script for a video called The History of Now, which
Stuff, and that's quite a cool podcast. And there's no such thing as a fish podcast. That's cool. That's funny. I listen to.
So there is a new sort of set of podcast episodes to catch up on, which is cool and nice, and I do.
Yeah. So, but the Verity podcast is very, very good. I just can't listen to it because I mean, I'd almost be reassured if it was like what the cracked podcast was saying, and it's just that they're
the last podcast is the last Digital Gonzo podcast, and it is the reason that the follow-up.
I was just checking around going, and I found Dan Carlin's podcast on the European referendum. And now,
the Let's Plays, there are always going to be reviews, and there are always going to be podcasts that I can listen to, right? Certainly I've got enough that I think are going to be...
catching up on the Critical Hit podcast, going to Nine Worlds Geek Fest, having my small amount of success from YouTube.
I have listened to other podcasts talk about The Dark Knight, right? You wouldn't think that I'm kind of reaching the dregs of the School of Movies podcast archive now. I have listened to... I listened to so many podcasts, watched so many Let's Plays, played so many games. I wrote so much.
I go by when I listen to podcasts and they say books that are interesting. I check them out, and because they kind of send Christmas cards around to their kind of podcast listeners, and they're kind of really cool, funny and sweet.
I've been sort of passing through your podcast history, and what do you think about the sort of radical podcast, and is the reason why its successor podcast was called The Digital Drift. It's a
Free of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan. They in fact wanted to get him on the podcast, and at that point I was just like, yay, podcast!
I could just watch the next episode of their podcast now. So you know what? Having a call to action at the end really does help. And lined up after I finish this New Adventures podcast, Fast Skate Friday podcast. So yeah. I was actually kind of surprised because I
generally I really wanted to read that because it's so good, but generally that podcast is well worth listening to. They've reviewed things like to not be bored of my tits, I have to listen to podcasts. So I listen to this podcast that I want to catch up on that is relevant to my current empire that's been studied so many times, and I've listened to the multiple podcasts and blah 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 blah. I know it. To hey, Vatican's in charge. Yes, there's many.
And also I am a massive fan of podcasts. So it's it's like I like YouTube reviewers
Stuff is because if I was gonna do a podcast with someone else, almost I'd worry that I'd end up talking over them. I'm scaring on my own because I'm just like, yeah, but I'm going to be listening to a podcast and an audiobook, so I don't want to do a fucking... I was Skyping my mate Tim, who's got his own podcast, Doctor Who podcast, and when the general election, pretty much, basically every time they've mentioned me on the podcast, it's just been mean. Effectively, it's just not been nice, and it's not... I mean, I was just listening to this program, right? This cracked podcast that was all about how, essentially dating, and all these podcasts that I follow, that I love, they weren't out, so I know the rules, so we're just gonna have fun, so that's what the podcast is. So the podcast is just kind of Alex Shaw ripping the almighty. Go over 3 hours. I'm not gonna split it because fuck it, the co-optional podcast is 3 hours. And yeah, and I think this is kind of view that I've seen best expressed in Dan Carlin's Common Sense podcast, where he sort of I watch reviews, which I pay no money for, and I listen to podcasts, which I pay no money for. A different podcast. Instead, I'm listening to CGP Kit Gray's podcast with Mike Hurley called Cortex, which is all about optimizing. Basket Friday podcast, the School of Movies podcast. I'm having fun and I'm being happy. I just am also continual. Well, I just recently finished listening to a major spoilers podcast review of the secret origins of Jessica Jones.
Then, if you are legit, fuck him. We could potentially record a podcast and see that out.
Well, I didn't see it, but I listened to this. To Dan Carlin's kind of podcast on the the Eastern Front of the Second World War. What I'll get is I'll be like, I'll be listening to a podcast or watching a Let's Play and sort of listen to the podcasts whilst you kill. And so the moment the podcast ends, it's like suddenly you can just listen to podcasts, to your audiobooks, and play it. You can listen to the Dissecting Worlds podcast. You can listen to Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast, Mike Duncan's and so because the film is like that, the podcast becomes more jovial and fun and loose. Awkward Open the Gates episode of his Waking Up podcast. And that, by the way, that podcast is why it feels an injustice to call this a series. This podcast, the creation of the character sheets will be shown off in the podcast, and how combat works will be shown off in the podcast as a sort of podcast, or maybe even potentially streamed. I'm just gonna play this while I listen to my podcasts. Well, I listen to music and stuff. I'm not gonna be, doing much interviewing the other members of the Major Spoilers podcast, such as Rodrigo and Matthew Peterson, about. Actually, I suppose I look at the brilliance of the podcast as basically it's like the podcast digests. Do something. Yeah. Listen to Dan Carlin, his sort of podcast on that, if you want something. Since I will not be able to veto it. Anyway, if you guys like the idea of a podcast or a newsletter from me, that there will be an official podcast of it at some point. But to begin with, it will start out with me contacting a person. I love his cracked podcast, and aside from that one instant where he's like, "Who the heck is PewDiePie?" I am amazed it took listening to a podcast to find something that is so
keenly attuned to exactly what I
stupid here. And it's a very, very funny podcast and very interesting, very insightful, and seriously,
it was good. I listened to a podcast that was also good. Yeah, like, sort of life being okay, mimic the things they are describing in terms of the tone and stuff. Kind of the podcast for the Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicle. I listened to these podcasts whilst playing Civ 5, and I played from 7 in the morning. Side and play with sticks and hoops, and it's like, yeah, but we've got podcasts now, and we've got Let's Plays, and we've got all these free going to go on Millennial Woe's podcast, and on Millennial Woe's video channel, if he will have me, and I will try.
the Revolution podcast. With the Revolution podcast, it's like, yes, this is, yes, you know how it's going to end, you know that it's going to be this, you know it's going to be listening to audiobooks and listening to podcasts and playing Minecraft and just digging holes and building shit. The Radio Free Scaro podcaster who
and there's one comment towards the end of the podcast where Alex Shaw says, when I listened to the podcast that shall not be named, that these are people who are very anti. I'm a big fan of Let's Plays, I'm a big fan of reviews, I'm a big fan of podcasts, and those things are all free.
things being in the shitter and whatever, I have been using this time listening to podcasts and not cycling on that thing.
I'm, loading up my podcasts and I'm going out and I'm walking and I'm seeing the world. I've got no fucking money, but oncoming Storm podcast episode about the Virgin New Adventures of Doctor Who, which
and stuff, so that you're not bored or whatever, and if it's an audiobook or a podcast, then you can play Minecraft while you're doing it. So
twists of fate. I discovered the Dissecting Worlds podcast because I had just listened from the fixed version from the Critical Hit podcast, because I thought that worked. And yes, I've already listened to the French Revolution podcast, and to be honest, Terra was.
And so kind of what my feelings, listening to this podcast are, holy shit, this is a really podcasters
to apparently it helps podcasters to leave a review on iTunes, right? And I know this from School of Movies is an amazing podcast. I've been listening to it while I've been playing Rome Total War.
It's kind of like, I play games, so I have something to do while listening to podcasts. I have incidentally, since...
And I've got video games, I've got podcasts, I'm good. Right? And because I've spent the past, I will be listening to podcasts, or I will be listening to music and thinking up stories for thinking up cracked podcast, and then I'm going to listen to some other podcasts. Maybe I'll start cracking on with Les Miserables. World's podcast. You can listen to Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast, Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. You can listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore. So I was listening to Dan Carlin's podcast kind of while I was doing some of this to a Scrolls podcast, which is basically it's sort of like Dissecting Worlds except for books. And I work I think I shall listen to Dan Carlin's 5-hour podcast episode on King of Kings. You know, it's spanning like 4 different generations of podcasts. It's not, at this point, it's not a series. So, I'm listening to this podcast or that podcast. I'm watching this video series or that video series. American Revolution, right? I mean, Mike Duncan's Revolution series, a podcast, covered the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Right? It's gotten to the point where I follow so many podcasts from America, where so much of pop culture comes. You've infected the Steam, and you keep fucking trying to infect my podcasts. I live for writing, and
There will probably be a topic video later in the day when I listen to a podcast and I'm like, ah! But for now, the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan. I listened to it all. It's a long podcast, and I listened to it all at university. Incredibly advanced and sort of shitty because of the app. Podcast and music player. I don't need shit. I don't. And I have just seen that there is a new NerdCube podcast because, yes, I have the iPad and it's got a nice problem saying, hey, there's a new nerd. Have the control to choose what podcast I will be listening to next when I go back to playing Skyrim and have my controller.
I've been listening to those productivity podcasts. Well, I've been listening to Cortex, which is a productivity podcast by CG. To play some Dishonored then, and I shall play Dishonored without the music, without the podcast. I shall just be playing it.
I need to find a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy podcast. I need to do this. I need to find a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy podcast now. Avatar reviews and the Lord of the Rings reviews left, really. Oh, and like the My Little Pony podcast and the Gamersgate podcast. And introduces me to his family, and they've well, not to his family, but to the family podcast thing that is Staggering Stories, which is a family of friends. Having listened to this podcast, yeah, the Tories have a heck of a long way to go before episodes out of a very, very long-running podcast series. You know, that's possible. That's possible. Pestering me about more fucking podcasts that I don't fucking like. Fuckwits on a certain podcast that shall not be named anymore because it turns out that, yeah, basically the YouTubers and reviewers and podcasters out there on the internet to find, you know, the kinds of things that we're interested in. Tune off, listen to podcasts, because it's just, instead of, it does everything Minecraft does. Back when I knew what the fuck I wanted to do with my life. Minecraft, same deal. All these podcasts that I am listening to now, I have a louder voice because he is gone. So now let's kind of to podcasts. So podcasts. I have a badge on my history of Alex Shaw's, podcasting. But as I kind of approach the point, one of the really the coat of arms of the Dissecting Worlds podcast on a badge, because I was one of the first 10 entrants. When it's on, I don't generally care. Yeah, I listen to Doctor Who podcasts, but again, I listen to them whilst playing games. Revolution.
the Revolutions podcast. Okay? So I'm there. Well, no, I'm here. I'm literally like here in my room, in a TV series, in a film, in a podcast, in a book. You have to worry about a limited amount of time.
Exists for, break in a podcast. Whereas if you're listening to an audiobook, right, that can be sometimes literally like, try to either right now or listen to the NerdCube podcasts. I'm not sure. Anyway, see you. Thank you to... I'm playing Skyrim again and I'm fucking loving that. I've got my podcasts that I enjoy, I've got my Let's Plays that I enjoy. As I'm listening to audiobooks and podcasts and just doing my thing, unlocking things and get up after having had very little sleep, walk in, listening to some podcast or some music. My brain I have, and it's like I'm listening to this podcast called Cortex with CGP Grey and Mike Curley, and
also I have spent a lot of time listening to a lot of history podcasts and we kind of in silence listening to the Dissecting Worlds podcast. Everything about this, and the thing is the podcast for Pacific Rim made it sound so deep, so intelligent. And then I watched it. Don't really listen to it anymore. I've kind of stopped caring about the Doctor Who podcasts because I sort of stopped caring about Doctor Who itself. There are better things to do with my life. There are better TV shows. There are better podcasts, better Let's Plays. There are better things that I could be doing. But yeah, I certainly started it on at least Brotherhood. And so I was listening to the podcast by Mike Duncan and I was playing it and like films. I am far more happier listening to audiobooks or podcasts than playing Skyrim or indeed writing. My own setup at the moment where I'm like, okay, I play video games, I listen to podcasts, I watch Let's Plays, and I've at the tail end of it now in terms of the podcasts, and I have listened to lots of Dissecting Worlds, and they've talked about, that listening to these podcasts on the Spider-Man films, and sort of who was there watching a lot of Blip videos, who listens to a lot of podcasts. I am someone who is very much part of we will scan through all of the different YouTube videos and podcast videos, and we will filter out the majority platformers. They're my kind of game. I like something that I can play whilst listening to a podcast, whilst listening to an audiobook, because I like, part of what I don't like so much about this sort of podcast of School of Movies is that I can't just call it listening to podcasts. Because I started tracking down podcasts, because podcasts is what I like, and I was like, kind of I noticed as I talked about, as I listened to the podcast, is, there's tons of narrative contrivances, listen to an audiobook or a podcast and play Skyrim or Minecraft or Space Engineers, but I have a iTunes podcast filled with podcasts to listen to. I have an Audible that I heard Johnny Maloney sort of recommend on the Word Funk podcast. There was something poetic about the dubstep, the electronic music, all lyricals. Kind of, these podcasts, they have a kind of pleasant John Carlin's Common Sense podcast. You can listen to Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast. You can listen to the Doctor Who The Writer's Room.
This is not the first time that they have fucking insulted me on their podcast. They have mentioned me before. They have
continuing to listen to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, and once I have caught up with this British history podcast, I will.
I forced myself to give a listen to the podcast where they to the podcast episode where they gave out that visceral. I mean, obviously this was a podcast discussing it, and you know they
I started getting interested because of the Critical Hit podcast, which is 4th edition, and then when I was up in Wolverhampton, actually I posted a comment on the Psychomedia podcast about this. I think I was referring to episode 12 and listen to podcasts. So I basically
but yeah, I'm listening to the Farscape Friday podcast, the School of Movies podcast. I am
every time. You know, it's a genuinely good podcast, but in that moment, I was just hearing, "You have no free."
I have basically embraced free entertainment mediums such as podcasts and YouTube and living cheaply on one meal a day in squat.
I want to read up about communism and Russia, and I'm listening to a Russian history podcast because I want to know the context and I want to know what.
And it's like men, you know, doctors and podcasters who say, hey, first do no harm, they are now. And so, yeah, I'm gonna have to do some interesting podcast searches. And Dan Carlin has put a new podcast out, and I think it's time to take stock of the situation.
The freemium economy of the internet, and you know, enjoy Skyrim and my podcasts, and you know.
And I'll do my writing, and I'll do my Skyrim, and I'll listen to many a true nerd in the podcasts, and I'll play some Skyrim. Of the School of Movies podcast, and sort of the history of Alex Shaw's, you know, podcasting.
So probably don't need to have them open, but oh well. And okay, so other podcasters, other guys that are fucking
Hotspots to use the internet and download podcasts, which means that kind of I don't have. But yeah, I've got podcasts lined up to listen to. I'm still watching through Blake Wright on this. And I can listen to podcasts on this. I just can't make stuff on this, and I just can't play games on.
And I'm promoting a podcast about the comedy and psychology, while also making some fairly disparaging comments about my time to leave because the rope runs out. You know that it is time to quit because the podcast is finished. I need to go. I do now, and the thing is, I know what I do now. I watch Xena, I play Minecraft, I do podcasts, I do volunteering, I do some work in the garden.
Mass Effect. This is a review of. This is a podcast on Mass Effect 3, right? That I'm listening to at the moment, and Cortex lately. Probably related, actually, given that finishing a podcast or Let's Play series often leaves me feeling at a loss. The podcast at the moment that's kind of nice and light. The British History podcast, also, that's very good, and that does have, like, a Patreon kind of. Man! I was like, and I will play some Skyrim and listen to podcasts, because fuck you guys, you know.
Trying to be happy, watching Let's Plays, playing games, and, you know, listening to podcasts, and when I talk to people, you know, no other podcast I listen to does that. Okay? And I know my videos. Progress done for the next episode.
and I will maybe, if I've got a podcast, do some farming and some grinding of mobs, but I won't. Here's where I stop, and here's where I think, and here's where, I go back to listening to my podcasts, and I have a sleep.
And any reason not to. So I stayed up late, listening to podcasts and playing Skyrim. And then I got work.
I listened to podcasts about Doctor Who, and I was just like, oh, I want to find podcasts about the Discworld, and now I actually know someone who...
Conclusion is, well, they're all evil. But the podcast also did present some of the other side, so I was not like, yeah. They base their podcast, sort of the tone of it, on the quality of the original. So sort of,
I was now listening to a podcast saying, hey, wouldn't it be very fucking awesome if you had friends to play Dungeons and Dragons with? I will do this when I listen to the co-optional podcast the minute I stop recording this. We need to go the other sound to play it at all, which means I can listen to podcasts while I'm playing it. And I experienced that, and that's awesome and amazing. And then
Muslims, and what the people at the podcast that shall not be named pointed out was, no, what essentially...
So, Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. There are 16 episodes in the sequence, with, as a first-person shooter, as something I want to play whilst I am listening to a podcast, it fails. So,
if Alex Shaw of the School of Movies podcast were to, in some hypothetical parallel, there is that much depth and nuance, and genuinely, I still listen to Doctor Who podcasts because there is so much depth. There is great horror sort of thing, to quote Matt Farr of the Dissecting Worlds podcast, the great terrifying
podcast. I'm listening to history podcasts that are pretty much all about how some clusterfuck led to war, led to revolution. And the way I'm going to say it is at least one podcast of exercise per day. At least one podcast of exercise per day.
Because I have now caught up with Hello Internet, the Hello Internet podcast. I have now caught up with that. And I've been listening to Wordfunk. And he's a fantastic Let's Player, and I love what he does, and so listening to the podcasts, it is
you need to do this properly. This needs to be a thing, like a podcast or a Just a Minute spin-off, or just like when Nicholas Parsons...
Of what? I've been watching Let's Plays. I've been listening to podcasts and playing Skyrim. Ah, yes, well, I will give you a full-on thorough...
Boring. I listen to history podcasts. I'm keen about the issues in the world today, but the actual... I love YouTube, because it's free and awesome. And I also love podcasts, because they're free and awesome too.
Going to pester me and insist. You are basically reinforcing that I will never ever go on the podcast that shall not be named. And I have insulted me before on their podcast, so yeah, you know what? I don't feel fucking guilty about calling a bunch of insult
Civil War and Batman Incorporated, and then I started listening to podcasts. Because I started tracking...
I feel like this is what it's become. I feel like I have started my own sort of little productivity podcast thingy on this channel. This is sort of like... This is basically a sort of visual podcast, You either like it or you don't. And if you don't want to stick through the whole video, then... I've heard Sam Harris you know, I am subscribed to his podcast, but I am very definitely aware. And incidentally, having listened to that podcast, I am very acutely aware of just how fucking strange the one, the only School of Movies podcast, and indeed, we do have the Dissecting Worlds podcast too. There is hope, ladies. I kind of want to introduce her to gaming and to podcasts and YouTube and say, hey, there is a whole world of free content out there. This podcast, a podcast video thing, in the sense that we will be recording the Roll20 session. So,
But as I've been listening back to the Dissecting Worlds podcast, because as I said, I love it when I listen to people go to learn the mad skills so I can get cats, right? Anyway, and I listen to audiobooks and podcasts while I'm playing Minecraft. I listen. This day you go out and do that. This day you listen to this podcast. This day you listen to that podcast. This day you play this game. This day you play that game. To the entirety of the Critical Hit podcast, to all of Dissecting Worlds, to
like, genuinely, like, when I finish a podcast binge and I have caught up, there is quite a genuine moment of panic as I'm just like playing a computer game, or you know, they're listening to a podcast, or an audiobook, or they're reading a book. You know, nobody
at the moment. My attention is going to be distracted between the podcast and or the audiobook and Skyrim. And this quest is important, so I can't.
Things like I've, you know, listened to history podcasts and stuff. And I've just, you know, I did the great, you know, I did the school. In order to hear something new, I listen to podcasts on things I know about, so I can get to know these new people, and I can entirely understand that, right? Like, my computer is my Let's Plays, is my podcasts, is my friends, is I have listened to the podcasts on the podcasts on Twilight and the 50 Shades of Grey.
I need to kind of say, I listen to podcasts. I listen to podcasts while I play games for much the same reason.
Because what this podcast does is it takes you through from kind of the Roman Empire through talking at me, because I've got a podcast and an audiobook to listen to, and it's just like, I want fun things. Is that you compare the Revolution podcast to the Prophets of Doom podcast. The Revolution.
Listen to the Doctor Who Book Club podcast with Eric Stadnick and Josh. I don't know last names of Sean or Josh because
but I listened to the Dissecting Worlds podcast on the Geek Syndicate podcast. It's a thing. It's kind of like
Alexander Gordon Jahans back from the abyss. You know, I've got my Skyrim, I've got my podcast, I've got my Let's Plays, I'm starting looking for a job.
Like, I'm playing Minecraft and I'm listening to podcasts, and it's all like fun, yay, whizzing around. Yes, thank you. That was our podcast on cells. Quite a lot like Rome. Yes, I do think it was quite a lot like Rome. And so, I'm doing all the same things I do at university. I'm listening to audiobooks, I'm listening to podcasts, I'm watching YouTube, I'm recording YouTube.
a friend of mine, Brian Taylor, of Just Bad Gamers, shared a podcast that he listens to. Well, at least I presume.
Email I regret. Okay, I'm never listening to that podcast again. So yeah, I watch a lot of Let's Plays. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I play a lot of video games. asking me about celebrities is just fucking ridiculous because I don't have tea at all. But it was, a 2.5 hour long podcast, which, logically would have taken to about
was, I am the good man, and I hated all of all of the podcasts I've been listening to because they're just like, oh, there are times where you meet people who you've heard on podcasts or whatever, and you're like, that means I can still watch TV, I can still play Minecraft, I can still listen to podcasts and audiobooks, and I can still do so many things. Because it's like, well, you found a good podcast app, but if you want to download more than one thing at a time, you've gotta pay. I had some podcasts saved up, I had some podquisitions that I hadn't listened to, and it was good listening to them, but then
I'm loving the School of Movies podcast. I'm loving the Dissecting Worlds podcast. Review the Future has got an episode on Trump, which I'm loving. Dan
very, very awesome. And generally, the podcasts, I listen to them whilst. You can't be an hour long. Your video's an hour long. Yeah. Co-optional podcast is fucking 3 hours long, mate. Spoony Experiments videos are for a young white guy. Kind of vary it up a little. Then Peter Capaldi was cast. So, yeah. I did not go into.
The thing with this little racist podcast comes to a head. Because
I know 3 different Doctor Who podcasts on Facebook, and I am friends with people who are immediately after Doctor Who has aired.
Is of kind of mostly podcasts of me doing some kind of Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition campaign. I'm writing things, I'm playing games, I'm listening to amazing podcasts, and oh my god, seriously, School of Movies is amazing, best podcast. Now watch any one of these other things, or listen to one of the podcasts. If there isn't a podcast you want to listen to one of the old podcasts. To that wretched podcast. I am, at the moment, basically dead inside. Turns out that, yeah, basically the Jewish apocalypse. That's what their podcast means, the Jewish fucking apocalypse. Oh, a duck. Yes, I love that podcast. There's shifters who are basically werewolves. One of my favourite podcasts, School of Movies, actually quite a bit more do not listen to the podcast on Friday, to the podcast on Nightmare on Elm Street, when it's you use knives, you use flip knives and whatever. But well, there's a podcast I listen to called Dissecting Worlds, right? Then I discovered that Cracked.com. Then I discovered the Cracked podcast. Then I got blown away by David Wong, and weak. And that was bad, because obviously, no Let's Plays, no podcasts, and no talking to friends. But also, it was life. I like that I got audiobooks and podcasts and games that I like, and I like that I'm stuff, and listening to the podcast was easier, but it's still kind of like I didn't fucking know anything. And then I listen to podcasts, or I watch videos, or I surf social media, or I do some writing. Commentator on Joshua Garrity. And I love him in other episodes of the School of Movies podcast. Hey, by chance, watching new media? Are they listening to podcasts? Are they watching reviews and news channels on YouTube? I listen to those, and then I listen to the Revolutions podcast. And I finished listening to the end of the Haitian Revolution.
It's been working up top. And it's just been fun listening to podcasts and stuff. But yeah, I'm kind of
washing up. And then I am going to listen to the Cracked podcast. And then I'm going to listen to maybe some other podcasts. Maybe I'll fucking get 2. Want to start a podcast with me where we discuss autism, literature, and politics? Maybe not. Probably not. Smith from the first series of Critical Hit podcast. There are different classes. There's the Avenger. Definitely link to a sort of podcast or whatever recording of the mumble thing, because subtitles on so I don't miss crest objectives. But mute the game, listen to a podcast, listen to an audiobook, and ended it off because the podcast finally came to an end of the 8th Harry Potter film, and it's like, okay, so listening to the School of Movies podcast on Pacific Rim that kind of made me kind of wake the hell up and go
podcast, because they were doing a podcast on religion in sci-fi and fantasy. So this is going to go here because they keep mentioning Rome throughout it all. Sort of like, yes, and that concludes our podcast on Klingons in Star Trek. Feeling so dreadfully awful about the Tories. Like, having listened to this podcast, I'm like, actually, you know what?
a bit nihilistic when I listened to the Nerdcube podcast and Nerdcube podcast, sorry, with sort of Dan. And then I listened to this podcast because what this podcast does,
The podcast that Dodger, Total Biscuit, and Jesse Cox do with guests. And the podcast, the history of Rome, and the Revolution series.
have thoughts, and I don't like the people on the podcast that shall not be named. The
Thing to this cracked podcast about how movies have changed perceptions or whatever.
not going on the fucking Daily Show. I'm not going on their fucking podcast. Now, there may be other interviews or discussions with alt-right people. This is going to be me just talking about why I love this podcast. And this podcast is School of Movies. Sort of laid out the trend of how the podcasts mimic the things they are describing in terms of the tone and stuff. Kind of,
Yeah. And I know there are Doctor Who podcasts that have women in them, that kind of, hold on. So yeah, it's this economics podcast, and it's all very right wing, and they were talking about.
because this is this horrible thing that happened. Revolutions podcast, I like it because it's this fascinating thing in the past. Like, your videos because they're fun, and I think they're fun. And I like to enjoy them. Hey, I love your podcast. It's really fun. Thank you. Hey, I'm going to chuck you some money your way because network has done in the sense that you have this podcast that starts with 2 guys talking about things, and then they say, so I'm not going to go on that wretched podcast. I know that a lot of people want me to, but I got it because I listened to the School of Movies podcast on it, and I wanted to see it. And last night, I
I kind of listening to that podcast. It's the kind of thing where you have to take a breather.
I get my knowledge from is like those podcasts and kind of, you know, I've got a podcast about, you know,
And to be honest, podcasts are really cheap to make, and those are very good and interesting to enjoy. A gamey person, I like your stuff. I just really love her podcast and her videos, and she's really cool and really awesome, and like just.
And you know, all these people that I listen to in podcasts and stuff were like, no, female doctor, no, it cannot happen, no.
Dissecting worlds that the History of Rome podcast is rather good and fascinating. So you know what? I'm going to check it out. Chill out and play casually whilst you're listening to a podcast that also at the same time happens to have a cracking story. It's like these adverts for Squarespace, you know, that you see on podcasts, that it's just like, yes, Squarespace.
it's also about this idea of like brain crack, which I think that if I check my podcast app,
I've got Skyrim, and I've got podcasts, and I've got YouTube. You know, my life is fantastic, and I'm making money by.
But listening to Dan Carlin's sort of podcast on the subject, it not only made me feel a lot calmer in the moment,
As a joke, saying, you know, I've been listening to a lot of these podcasts, and they've all got sponsors now. Of the Co-optional podcast, 3 fucking hours of the Co-optional podcast. Although Jim Sterling is fucking awesome, but and I in general highly recommend that podcast as well, because I'm learning from it. It's, you know, they're past, and once I have caught up with this British history podcast, I will I will listen to another of the Ian M. Banks' books.
Now, I know that many people are creaming their pants because, oh my god, the podcast that shall not be named mentioned Alex Jahans again.
Covered. Okay, there are podcasts. There are Let's Plays. There are so many YouTube videos. There are
Released this is a very sort of weird podcast. But anyway.
Got something for just about everybody in here. Give a holler if you haven't.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
well,
What have you?
and I've also been listening to a lot of podcasts. So that's been fun. And the Review the Future podcast is a fantastic podcast, and in it they sort of they talk
for someone new to it, for someone who's just like, hey, free podcast, I want to listen. So it's good that it can be skipped. And I've been listening to history podcasts, like, and I have basically gotten together a rough timeline in my head. I really highly recommend them. They are the only podcast that I will re-listen to. I love them fucking tremendously. I have picked up through various different things of history podcasts. I actually know more about the Marxist theory. Interesting if I just said, oh yes, so I listened to this podcast and they said some things, and I didn't like some of them, but I thought some of them were okay. We're going full circle, you know, and just now, like the Doctor Who podcast, that, you know, even when I disassociated
computers and cameras and that we can listen to music and podcasts and watch YouTube videos and
Rim, that the podcast about Pacific Rim goes into that with the depth that I want. This
and just go, oh my god, have you heard about this? This is so awesome. Let me do all about it. And so I looked up podcasts about
the Discord because
And I'm gonna talk about a sort of fan theory that I've just heard on a podcast that I think makes Voyager so much more awesome.
But the Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast. I've listened to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. I'm a big fan of the Cracks podcast. I'm a big fan
The podcast. If there isn't a podcast you want to listen to one of the old podcasts. Listen to Dissecting Worlds. Listen to School of Movies. An immense sort of relief and joy to realise, oh, this podcast that I'm going to love listening to, it's got women in it. Yay!
Dan Carlin's Blueprint for Armageddon, or his, World War One podcast thing. I gather that came out.
fans of people from Canada, and a lot of my favourite podcasters and Let's Players, they're from Canada. Canada's nice. Right? Like I listen to podcasts and I constantly it's Harry's Razor Blades, Squarespace, TV. I love the new media. I love the podcasts and the video games and the Let's Plays and I love and sort of just leave me in a great existential angst. An interesting podcast from Cracks that's kind of like,
Because podcast is what I like, and I was like, I'm gonna try and, do this shit. I'm gonna finding that they were too boring on their own, and so I would have podcasts on to have an accompaniment to the video game.
very happy. I listen to my podcasts. I play Skyrim, and after I finish Skyrim, I've got Oblivion and Morrowind. So
I want to talk about that podcast and about other things because basically, this podcast has been
I give a shit about all the world building and the depth and all this stuff that the podcast goes into. I thought at the time made Millennial Woes seem better than the people at the podcast that shall not be named, was that primarily about actually making the fucking the video podcasts and the sort of the plans for the series. So please let me finish this. By this point, I have listened to the Revolutions podcast, and it's even finished the Haitian Revolution, and I don't even know.
He and some other people at crack.com were doing a podcast, and they were talking about how internet and to a certain extent I could sacrifice podcasts, except the podcasts I'm actually listening to history podcasts now, and so getting interested in history podcasts because let's face it, I need shit to enjoy. Podcasts are free and readily available. It's very interesting listening to the Revolutions podcast and the Dissecting Worlds podcast is. I've got a badge on my jacket from
that I didn't have a fucking clue what I was going to listen to, and it's like, okay, I had the podcast that shall not be named. I had to listen to the connect to Facebook and stuff on this, and I can listen to podcasts on this. So this could keep me alive, and because this episode of this podcast is 4 hours of escalation
of Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, and it was Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast that I listened to. Dan Carlin of Hardcore History did a 4-hour-long podcast called Painfotainment.
I'm a big fan of Dan Carlin's Common Sense podcast, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, and I am someone just 15 minutes into the Scream podcast, and they're sort of talking about, sort of the pop cultural awareness to podcasts or audiobooks, because it helps me remember all of those podcasts and audiobooks, because I am constantly need to do this. I need to find a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy podcast now. Thank you for watching this video, ladies and gentlemen.
I was going for a stage of like contacting podcasts I like, and then it was just like, oh, the shame, the shame. What have I?
And you know, especially when it comes to history podcasts, it's like, yes, I know that I'm getting one biased opinion.
It sounds very interesting, and the podcast is, I suppose, having sort of laid out the trend of how the podcast.
One of the things that I love about the sort of critical hit podcast is their take on skill challenges. So the idea is that a skill challenge.
I've been listening to a lot of history podcasts at the moment, so the idea of having a purge, just the Geek Syndicate is like the BBC of podcasts, in that they do a whole load of different shows, and
I have been thinking about doing a podcast for quite some time. Partly because, you know, if you are interested in doing any kind of podcast or whatever, be wary of that. You know, be aware that
They are. It's a productivity podcast, and they basically exclusively use Apple products.
podcasts I'm actually listening to history podcasts now, and so those are inspiring me with the writing, and those are saying, hey, Skyrim, I've got all my Steam games, I've got all my podcasts, I've got all my audiobooks. Why? And like this podcast, the Dungeon Masters Block podcast, and it was on how to start a game of Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, I've been listening to Cortex, which is a productivity podcast by CGP Grey, who essentially, like, CGP Grey is someone that I.
These fuckers have put out a new video, a new podcast, in which they
go do something else, and I have a podcast or whatever on in the background, then I need to pause Skyrim, I need to close, you know, how it reacted to the latest news. But I'm still like listening to podcasts, I'm still like thinking up essays in my head.
Just you know, get my music on, get my podcast on, get my jams on, and just walk for fucking who knows.
Plays games whilst listening to audiobooks and listening to podcasts as someone who is in the middle of a critical hit.
I mean, I was listening. I've been listening to Review the Future, which is a podcast on sort of futurism and discussing the future. And they were talking.
Where I used to spend every time listening to podcasts or audiobooks playing Minecraft, I now play Skyrim.
I had heard might be in my sort of line of thinking, and so I listened to the Cracked podcasts. I sort of finished up my
and TV programs. We need to have films made about this. We need to have podcasters and radio shows, and we need
these podcasts. I can't go through podcast by podcast that I have listened to, going, well, this was really awesome because this and this was really awesome. It's a very interesting sort of set of podcasts, and I'm kind of, you know, I've got a nice backlog to go through now, so it's just like
nothing that can really distract me because I've got podcasts and I've got an audiobook, and without getting
sort of moved to catching up with the Cracked podcast after I'd not been, you know, catching up with that. And the Cracked podcast had sort of started to, you know, I've been listening to Revolution podcasts, and people are saying, down with the bourgeoisie, right? So, I'm saying, yeah, we're staging a revolution, you know what? So, if you are interested in doing some kind of podcast or whatever, be aware that there will be
then I went to the Finding Your Voice panel in podcasting, which was useful for like someone who liked listening to Let's Plays and podcasts and played Minecraft or even ate food. So this person